Hello and welcome to Inside the Vault. My name is Sandy Trenholm, and I'm the collection director for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And tonight we're going to be discussing the Salem witchcraft trials with Dr. Karin Wulf. Now, before we begin, I just want to remind you that this program is being recorded. Your camera and your mic are automatically turned off, and the chat has been disabled. If you wish to submit a question, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Summer and Taylor, our interns, are managing the back end tonight, so they're going to be taking your questions and putting them in a list for us to talk to Karin about at the end of the program. Just as another reminder, you will be getting a PD certificate tomorrow. So if you don't have one by the end of the day tomorrow, feel free to email us, but otherwise you should be getting it in your email first thing, probably about right after lunch. Which brings us to today's feature document. It's a favorite of mine out of the collection. You probably hear me say that a lot. This is Cotton Mather's book, Wonders of the Invisible World. The one we're featuring from the collection tonight is the first London printing. What I find kind of interesting, I don't know if you can see it on this side, it says December 23rd, 1692 is when it was authorized to be printed, and it was printed in 1693. So that's right in the heart of the trials. It seems like current events of the time period, but is such a historic relic for us. So I'm excited to learn more about that. And so without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Karin Wulf, Director and Librarian at the John Carter Brown Library and Professor of History at Brown University. She's a historian of gender, family, and politics in 18th century British America. And her current book, Lineage, Genealogy, and the Power of Connection in Early America, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. And we had a great time talking to Dr. Wulf in preparation for tonight's event. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from you tonight. So thank you for joining us tonight. And do you know when your book is coming out? Do you have a date for us yet?
Oh, I love that you asked that question. OUP is saying June.
All
So
right.
let's keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah,
I'm
I'm looking
excited.
forward to it.
Thank you.
All right.
Me too. Thanks
I'm
so
gonna
much.
turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much. So thanks, Sandy. And I want to thank Gilder Lehrman for having us all here and all of you for joining us to think about the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692-93. This is really a kind of introduction to a really complex historical phenomenon that has occupied the thinking of an enormous number of historians. So let's just dive in. Can I have the next slide? Great. Okay, so this is going to tell you that I'm going to talk a little bit about some background for thinking about what happened in Salem. But let me give you a few comments and notes first. I think, yes, thank you very much, Summer, for putting those links there. Two of the links that I've shared with you are for documentary materials that you can explore. One of the greatest things about digitization and the internet, which does have its ups and downs. One of the ups is here we all are gathered on a Thursday evening from all kinds of places around. There are some downsides. We don't need to go there. And I will resist making connections to witchcraft. But anyway, but one of the great things really is access to primary sources that online availability gives us. And I've given you two. One is to some documentary editing at the University of Virginia, which is a fantastic resource for materials. That number 4 in that list that you can see in the chat is for collections from the trial record that are at the Peabody Essex here in New England, where I'm located. And I'm going to talk about the other two as I go through here. So I'm coming to you from Providence, Rhode Island, and Salem is not that far from here. Okay, so the object or the text that we're centering today is this book. It's really actually a little pamphlet. It's only 8 pages long, written by a New England minister named Cotton Mather, which is an excellent name. Cotton Mather comes from a long line of ministers and the many, many Mathers of New England. And this book or pamphlet is titled, as Sandy said, Wonders of the Invisible World. It's subtitled, or one of its subtitles, it actually has 4, is observations, historical and theological, upon the nature, the number, and the operations of the devils. So how is this thing about wonders of the invisible world, about witchcraft, which is our topic today, when the book is invoking wonders of the invisible world and suggests it's going to be about history and religion and promises this kind of detailed examination through the nature, the number, and the operation of devils, notice plural, not singular. Well, Cotton Mather wrote this in the immediate wake of this intense episode in Salem, Massachusetts, of people being accused of and taken to court and tried for and executed for being witches. And almost immediately in the wake of this episode, this kind of spasm of violence, people who were involved, some of the judges, ministers, in fact, other people, began to express regrets, but Mather did not. So I'm going to come back to this in the end, what he was saying in this pamphlet and why and how this odd, really interesting book helps us understand Salem witchcraft. So let's dig in. Okay, so even though I've got a slide up that says explanations, European background, I'm actually going to tell you a little bit of like factual stuff here about Salem, just to start us off. Okay, so what happened? Well, what happened in the most kind of cold-blooded terms is that between kind of February of 1692 and May of 1693, so a little over a year. Some people date it in December of 1691, but it's a little over a year, all of 1692 for sure. In Salem, Massachusetts, which is in the very eastern part of the state, if you're not from New England and you're not super familiar with Massachusetts, in the very eastern part of the state, it's right on the coast there. In Salem, Massachusetts, there's a population of maybe 2,000 people. I don't know where you're coming from, but I'm in the lovely small city of Providence, Rhode Island. And even for me, 2,000 is a kind of hard number to get my head around. That's a pretty small number of people. I'm here at Brown University, and we have a student population alone that's more than double 2,000. But anyway, in Salem, there was a population in the 1690s of maybe 2,000 people. And almost 200 of them were accused of witchcraft. About 75% of those 200 were women. About 60 people were actually tried as witches in a court, and half of them were convicted, and 19 of them were executed, and one person died in jail. So that's about 10% of the population of Salem that was accused, and 1% of the population that was executed. If I can beg your indulgence here to make a comparison that's not a perfect one, but let's just stay with this for a minute. That's like right now, if we think about the population of New York City, population of 8 million people in New York right now. That's like if 800, so that's where Gilder Lehrman is, right? That's why I chose New York rather than my own home here in Providence. Population about 8 million. That's like as if 800,000 people were all accused and 80,000 people executed of the same crime, of just this one crime, right? That's pretty dramatic. To give some perspective, in New York City in 2022, there were about 100,000 people arrested all over New York for all kinds of crimes. So this is like 8 times that for just one thing, witchcraft. And the other thing I have to say, because we're going to talk about gender, is that now when we look at criminal accusations and prosecutions, even in a world we know right now, the United States has, incarcerates a much higher percentage of people than in our peer kind of nations. But about 75% of people who were arrested in New York were male. But in Salem, 75 to 78% of the accused were women. So there's something different going on here, but I think it's instructive for us to think about the enormous impact of these numbers. The numbers are a big part of the story. Okay. So, but when we say what happened, I think we're not necessarily saying what happened. Could you talk about the numbers? How many people actually did this happen? How many people did that happen? We often mean, I think, when we're talking about Salem witchcraft, How could it have happened? What's the explanation for why it happened? It seems kind of otherworldly, literally, to us that this kind of phenomenon could take place, even though we ourselves live in a world with a lot of violence. The Peabody Essex Museum, which I noted here in the chat, has those wonderful collection of court materials. They don't hold them anymore. They've digitized them, made them available to you. They're actually held in the Judicial Archives and the Massachusetts State Archives. But they call it a stunning example, or a defining example even, of intolerance and injustice, Salem. So what happened? Like, why? All right, we're going to dig into that a little bit, and we're going to dig into some of what historians think. But I can't help giving one more little piece of context here, which is that there's a reason why Gilder Lehrman asked me to come and talk about Salem witchcraft in October, right? Witchcraft is also inflected with the season of Halloween, with the idea of witches as something maybe out of Hocus Pocus, movie I love. Hocus Pocus 2, in fact, was filmed just a few blocks from where I'm sitting right here at the John Carter Brown Library in Providence. Something odd, maybe funny, maybe even kind of endearingly weird, witch hats and pumpkins and so on. Think of all the popular culture that centers on the idea of witches or the near witchy. Like the Sanderson sisters of Hocus Pocus aren't the first three weird sisters. That distinction goes to Shakespeare's witches from Macbeth. So witches are, in popular culture for a long time. I personally love the Netflix series Wednesday, which no one can tell me isn't kind of a near witchy kind of thing. Season 2 coming next year, apparently. And Salem itself is now a massive tourist attraction, most especially in the month of Halloween, when more than 1 million visitors are expected. But I have to say, too, that in Salem, witchcraft, as indicated by that comment from Peabody Essex about this being a kind of defining example of intolerance and injustice, the Salem witchcraft has also produced some sober reflection, in addition to lots of witch hats being sold and lots of stuffed black cats. In 1711, in fact, the first pardons were issued to witches or accused witches. 22 of the accused were exonerated. And in 1957, and then in 2001, more of the accused were exonerated. And just in 2022, and that's the article about the last Salem witches finally cleared from Smithsonian. In 2022, thanks to a Massachusetts middle school teacher and her students, the last of the accused witches of Salem, Elizabeth Johnson, was pardoned. So we all, I think, bring a lot to this topic. People are super interested in it, but we bring ideas about it. We bring a level of discomfort about the violence that happened. I know from some of the questions that some of you sent ahead of time that people wonder, like, what does this have to do with women? We're going to talk about that. What does this have to do with the kinds of Christian context in New England? We're going to get to that. But we also come to it here in October. We're doing this in Halloween, right? We are not doing this actually in the months, well, I guess one of the months that that witch trials were taking place, but we're not doing this in May, right? We're doing this in the month when things are getting spooky out. Okay. All right. So some explanations for Salem really have to begin with the European background, which is quite important. There were waves of violence across Europe and Britain across the 15th through 17th centuries. And one thing that's really interesting, well, horrifying, I guess, but anyway, is that while tens of thousands of people were tried and executed for being witches in Europe between these hundreds of years, it wasn't quite as sharply gendered, actually, as it was in New England, or actually in Old England either. It's a pretty complex picture, actually, what produces those waves of violence, but essentially, and I know those of you who teach will appreciate this. Anytime you make a generalized statement, you know that actually there's all kinds of particular context you're skipping over. But let me just say that essentially ideas about magic converged and then diverged with Christianity as it moved through Europe and Britain. And at some points, Christianity as it was merging and growing stronger, enhanced fears and accusations of witchcraft. And then at times, witchcraft was associated with kind of old, unchristian ideas of superstition and was discarded. And that's ultimately what happened in New England. But we do know that the people who settled New England from Britain came from a place that was deeply familiar with witchcraft. So that's one. There are these waves of violence across the 15th through 17th centuries in this place where the settlers in New England had come from. A second is that the process of witchcraft accusation and trials was really strongly affected by different legal systems. Witchcraft was in New England a crime, and it was tried in a court of law. You can't try something, you can't try someone for something unless you have already determined that it is against the law, right? So there are places in Europe where witchcraft became against the law, and then accusations and trials rose up. And there were places where it actually hadn't been written into the law that witchcraft per se was illegal. So different legal systems actually really influenced what happened with these kinds of waves of early modern witchcraft, when it was and when it wasn't recognized as a crime, and when it was punished as such. And then the third context point here is that a lot of this originates in ideas. Oh, it says delivery there. It's not about delivery. That should read devilry. There's a typo there. Everyone can appreciate a little typo in the text there. Okay. Ideas about devilry or the devil. So, and I want to distinguish those two things too, because sometimes witchcraft accusations, there's some slippage in what the accusers are talking about. Are they talking about the devil? That is this idea that became prominent in some parts of Christian thinking and practice, that there was this counterbalancing force, kind of Christ's enemy, this counterbalancing force that was trying to prevent Christianity or prevent Christian society, or devilry, which was this kind of idea that devilish activity was taking place. But all of this witchcraft stuff is originating somehow with those kinds of beliefs. So what were some of these kinds of practices that people were identifying as potentially witchcraft? Well, there's a famous book called the Malleus Maleficium that's published in the 1480s that many people point to as a kind of turning point in witchcraft in Europe. And you can find it on the internet, and it absolutely lays out in pretty clear terms what is understood by malicious witchcraft and supernatural criminal behavior. But the basic idea is that it's causing harm to others by supernatural means. So that one is, it's not you yourself who is doing something harmful to another person, but that you are using supernatural forces, the devil or devilry, to create harm. Illnesses, especially to children, are often identified as the work of witchcraft. Sudden illnesses in livestock, which are extremely valuable possessions to people, are often explained as the work of witches or witchcraft. Other kinds of ordinary things that sort of upend orderly life in all kinds of ways that actually sometimes might seem to us a little silly. Sometimes we read some of the accusations and it's hard not to side eye or actually sometimes laugh at them, even though the consequences were so dire. People would say that they had a calf or a calf that was taken ill, or a cow that stopped giving milk. Maybe a child suddenly became ill after, and someone would say it was after they encountered a particular person. And these things seem to us absurd. Like, that doesn't seem like reasonable evidence of, malicious intent, or certainly not of witchcraft. But these are exactly the kinds of things causing harm to others by supernatural means that were identified as the work of witchcraft. Okay, So let's go to the next slide, and we will dive into some of the many explanations that historians have given for what happened in Salem. I have to just pause for a minute to say that the kind of overarching context here for what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to give you three examples of historical interpretations of Salem. But the overarching context is, I would call, the kind of hot and intense context of European settlement in New England. Who was settling and what happened when they settled? These were people that came into indigenous lands, and they came to New England, these Puritans, with very intense ideas about what kind of society they wanted to develop. They wanted a Puritan society, a godly society, run on the rules of a very particular kind of Protestantism that was new in Europe and that they were trying to instantiate in New England. So, and by the time we get to the Salem conflict in 1692, these folks had spent 7 decades in a kind of intent and intense kind of colonization effort and a series of conflicts with one another. They were almost never out of kind of arguing with, sometimes in violence with, either indigenous people in the region or with one another. You know, the Puritans, when they arrived in New England, starting in the 1620s, then really starting rolling in the 1630s, they were fighting with one another almost right from the beginning. And in fact, they were banishing people right from, starting in the 1630s. So the kind of social conflict that we see in Salem is not new to New England and not new to this society. They had already been full of angst. Okay, so the first kind of historical interpretation I want to introduce you to, and many of you may know a little bit about it, was made famous in a book by Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum, published in 1974, Salem Possessed: The Social Origins of Witchcraft. So Boyer and Nissenbaum's book is a kind of social history effort to explain how it is that social and economic conflicts can tell us why people accused one another of witchcraft. And basically what they did is they looked at people who were living in Salem Village, which is the map that you're seeing right now, and tried to understand whether there were dynamics at work that were setting them against one another. And what they argued was, and if you can see the slide there's this little key, A for accusers, D for defenders, and W for accused witches. And they drew this dotted line down the middle of Salem Village to show on the eastern side, there are many more accused witches. And on the western side, there are many more accusers. So their question was, what's going on there? And I'm giving you a simplified version now of their actually kind of simplified argument. But the argument here was essentially that folks who were doing the accusing were folks who had a more traditional, rural, farming, socioeconomic position. And the folks who were being accused were aligning themselves more closely with the kind of merchant class and the kind of Atlantic economy that folks in Salem town, which was a little further distant, had been engaging in. So to really simplify this, it's not exactly like farmers versus merchants, but there was a little bit of this idea that this is both a class thing and not necessarily how much money did people have, but where did they derive their income? And where did they see their socioeconomic futures? And the folks who were feeling anxious seemed to be accusing people that they thought were making them anxious about their futures. That's the basic argument of Salem Possessed. I'm pretty sure Boyer and Nissenbaum would be annoyed by that kind of flattening out of their argument. And in fact, and it is enormously influential. This book has sold hundreds of thousands of copies over the years. Interestingly, in 2008, and I referenced this in the Q&A in the William & Mary Quarterly, a series of scholars took up questions about Salem. It was a kind of Salem Reconsidered whole forum in this academic journal, which is great to read. I highly recommend it. You can log into JSTOR and you can get a JSTOR account. You can get a few free issues there. But scholars looked at some of the major interpretations, and some of them really took aim at what Boyer and Nissenbaum did. And some in particular said, hey, you see that dotted line down the middle? Do you know what happens if you just move the dotted line a little bit one way or another? The interpretation looks quite different. And also said, look, they used tax lists and some probate inventories. So trying to understand people's socioeconomic situation based on how much money maybe somebody had, based on when they died, what did they have? And so said, you know what, it just wasn't as stark as they laid out. What I want to say about this is that that's a really interesting and important interpretation that I think probably resonates with many of us, though, this idea that there might be a socioeconomic explanation for the kind of upsurge in accusations in this town, that maybe there is something behind this that has some other origin. And maybe it's about kind of who is on the downside of the economic scale and who is rising in a kind of escalating economy. Okay, next slide, please. The next one I want to talk about is a book written by a historian at the University of Michigan, Carol Carlson, also very influential, The Devil in the Shape of a Woman. I think she gives us very nicely the thesis of this book in the title. I always appreciate that. So Carlson really was the first scholar to point squarely at what needed to be explained right off the bat about Salem, which is misogyny. She said, look, it is not accidental, but essential that the huge percentage of those accused and then, of course, executed for witchcraft were women. Misogyny, of course, is the ingrained prejudice against women. And Carlson said, we have to understand that in Puritan New England, there are two dynamics at work here that are kind of structural misogyny, if it were, as it were. One is the Puritan emphasis, their kind of religious and theological emphasis on women as uniquely susceptible and weak. So weak and thus uniquely susceptible to the devil. The second is the sharp, legally sanctioned gender hierarchy in colonial New England and throughout colonial British America, that women were disadvantaged legally in all kinds of ways. So Carlson broke down really what was happening there in terms of the percentage of women who were accused, who were taken to trial, and then who were convicted and executed of witchcraft, and tried to break it down and look at what are some of the commonalities, what made some women very vulnerable to these accusations. So she said, let's look at, for example, what kinds of women were more likely to be accused than others. For a long time, historians had been saying that it wasn't necessarily women who were poor and women who were on the margins of the society. Originally, one theory was that, look, if you were poor and marginalized, you were seen as different, and you were seen maybe as someone who was not knitted into a traditional family, and thus maybe you would be susceptible to being accused of witchcraft. But Carlson said, actually, what it looks like is that the women who are most susceptible to being accused of witchcraft are not women who were poor necessarily, but women who were, and let me parse this carefully, without a male protector. And what she meant by that was these were women who were both they were potentially inheriting property because they didn't have husbands, brothers, or sons. So they were more likely in their family to inherit or already to hold property of their own. In other words, they were women without independent capacity. So not only were they without a male protector, they didn't live necessarily always within a male household, or even if they did, they had their own property. These were women who were seen as independent. And in the kind of ideology of Puritan New England, that's out of step. That is out of place for women. Women were meant to be in that gender hierarchy subordinated. It's interesting, Carlson points to just what a range of women are accused. So it's not like all the women who were accused of witchcraft fit that profile. The women were an incredible range of ages and in an incredible range of situations. Among the first three women to be accused, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, an enslaved woman who was either indigenous from North America or indigenous from the Caribbean. It's kind of hard to tell. But those women were themselves very differently positioned. Tituba, obviously enslaved, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, very differently positioned. Sarah Good's and the two Sarahs were executed, and Tituba confessed. I'll get to that in a minute, confessed, but actually wasn't executed. Sarah Good's little 4-year-old daughter, though, Dorcas Good, was also accused and was incarcerated, a little bit of house arrest there, but for the better part of a year. So it's a wide range of women. It's not just one kind of women. Carlson's point was just that the tendency was for accusations to kind of head towards women who seemed independent or who were economically independent. And some of the accusations belie this. Some accusations describe these women as angry. Some of the ways in which they describe, she has a great accusation of Sarah Good as when she was arrested, she went muttering away and she's scolding all of her neighbors extremely. She was railing upon the jury and the witnesses. In other words, like being angry. I don't know. I think I would be angry if I were accused of witchcraft too. But being angry or being prideful, that's another characteristic that was pointed to. And Carlson takes this apart and says, look, this has a lot to do with these ideas about gender. The other thing she notes is that most of the men who were accused of that, so that percentage of men, were attached to some of those women in one way or another. It's interesting to look at some of the men and what happens to them. There is actually one of the ministers, and I wasn't going to talk about this, but there is another piece of the Boyer and Nissenbaum kind of argument that says, well, maybe this is about an argument over the parish churches and a kind of competition there. What's happening there, because there is a minister, George Burroughs, who was also accused. So the third I want to talk about is a book by Mary Beth Norton from 2003 called In the Devil's Snare, as you see right there. And Norton takes something I mentioned, which is the importance of this colonial context. And she expands the geography of Salem to say, okay, if Boyer and Nissenbaum were looking just at Salem to say, what are the conflicts developing within Salem? And how can we understand that as producing this upsurge in accusations and this extraordinary violence? Norton says, let's broaden the scope here and see what's going on in New England more broadly. And she points to the series of imperial wars, in particular those wars that were wrapping in indigenous people and in which New England settlers were in deep conflict and deep and violent conflict with indigenous people, particularly the one known as King Philip's War in 1676, which is extraordinarily violent, and then King William's War in the 1680s. So according to Norton's research, it was refugees from Maine who had been involved in some of the most recent conflict in King William's War, who had come to Salem, who were predominated among the accusers, those people who are accusing others of witchcraft. And her argument is that these had been people who were deeply affected by warfare and also deeply, profoundly biased and prejudiced against indigenous people, and associated indigenous people, these settlers did, indigenous people with the devil and with devilry again. And, part of her argument rests on an idea about maybe post-traumatic stress, maybe the long-term, many decades long impact of violence on communities, which I think, we have some good social science research about that now. We can talk in the Q&A a little bit about how our social science research about these things illuminates this. So those are three of the most kind of prominent analyses. It's interesting to me that if we try to think about what really happened in Salem, I wish I could tell you something different, but I believe that we don't know. I believe that one of the most powerful things about the Salem witchcraft is that it reminds us that history is really hard. And while humans are humans the world over and throughout time, the contexts are so different that we may never fully understand precisely what happened, but we can try and we can keep trying. And that's clearly what we do with Salem. So a scholar of 17th century New England religion and science named Sarah Rivet, who teaches at Princeton now, wrote about, I think really compellingly, our urge to find a rational explanation for Salem, the way that we keep looking. And she wrote in this same issue of the William and Mary Quarterly, she said, we have looked at psychological transference, women on the margins, social repression, collapsing Puritan ideas and community, hallucinogenic mushrooms, magic, traumatic military violence, but maybe it was all of those things or none of those things. She says maybe we really do just have to understand that their ideas are fundamentally different than ours. Okay, last slide. So let's go to Cotton Mather, where we began. All right, so what is going on in this wonderful text that Gilder Lehrman has offered to us? I've given you two examples here of Mather's wonders. And the first one that Sandy showed you is the first London edition there. The one on the right is held here at the JCB Library, which is actually the Boston edition. And I am betting you notice something very different about it right off the bat. It's framed very differently, right? Devils jump right out at you. So let's say a few things here. First of all, Mather's own background. I said that he comes from a long line of ministers. He's named, he actually converges to ministerial lineages, the Mathers and the Cottons, which is why he's named Cotton Mather, John Cotton, and his own father, Increase Mather. Cotton Mather is a guy who is both at once very sure of himself and kind of frenetic in my reading, frenetically anxious. He is living in a world that is really complicated and he's trying to understand it and trying to get on top of it. And he writes just like, that great line from Hamilton about like, why do you write like you're running out of time? Well, let me tell you, like Cotton Mather was like the Alexander Hamilton of the 17th century. We have, when I went upstairs into the stacks at the JCB here to look at our copy of the Wonders of the Invisible World, we have just these unbelievable shelves of Cotton Mather's publications. They just go on and on. But a one I want to point out to you is that in 1692, so that's just before this, he published his lengthiest treatise on womanhood. And I'm going to quote here, not actually from it, but from something that describes it. And it was called The Ornaments for the Daughters of Zion. And his purpose, he said, was, quote, to advocate virtue among those who cannot forget these ornaments and to promote a fear of God in the female sex. So Mather is really attuned to the problem of women. And he writes other things about women too. He writes about women who have lost their babies to miscarriage, and he ascribes all kinds of complex motivations to them. He's got a lot going on there. So I think, Mather in this particular publication is, on its surface, what he's doing is he is defending the use of what was known as spectral evidence in the witchcraft trials. What happened in the trials themselves is that they relied on basically three kinds of things. They relied on confessions, people saying, yep, indeed, I'm a witch. And many of those were coerced. They tortured people to get those confessions. So they relied on confessions, first of all. Secondly, they relied on testimony. They had neighbors come in and testify, yep, Rebecca Nurse walked by me and, the next thing I knew, X and Y happened. And the third thing they relied on in the courts was what's called spectral evidence. That is stuff that's unseen by others. So some of the famous accounts of Salem witchcraft are some of the young girls who describe themselves as being overtaken and overcome. And they would say, I saw something, I saw a bird, I saw this happen, I saw a familiar, an animal with one of the women who was accused or something. Spectral evidence is the kind of stuff unseen by others. And it's very controversial in the court, but they allow it in Salem. And it actually becomes quite controversial in the kind of Anglo-American legal tradition. And some of the judges recant almost immediately. Samuel Sewell, who's a super prominent judge, who's one of them, almost immediately says, this was a mistake. This was a huge mistake. This whole thing was a big mistake. But Cotton Mather is like, nope, spectral evidence is fine. And what we did there was fine. You see these observations. That's why he's got that in the Boston edition. Observations, devils. That's what he's doing there. He is defending the fact that spectral evidence was used in these trials. So Cotton Mather, I think, is a window onto at least one aspect of the Salem witchcraft trials, but he's a better window, I think, onto some of the intense conflicts and some of the belief systems of late 17th century Puritan New England. So I'm going to stop there because I can already see that the Q&A is pretty full. And I know we had some questions before we started. So thank you all so much. It's been fun to talk with you. I'm sorry we don't have hours and hours more.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wulf. And Summer's going to come on and ask a few questions for us. I do find it interesting that the London printing is based on the Boston printing, but they changed that title page so much. It's amazing.
Yes. Well, right. I mean, you can see they're doing different things, right? They want, first of all, they need the buyers to know that this is about New England. Yes. You can see how important that is. Witches, very important. That's a legible category for people in England. They understand what witches are.
Yeah. They also misspelled Boston, which I find funny.
Right. Well, I misspelled devilry, so I'm
and we didn't catch it, so it's all fair. All right, so Summer, do you have some questions for us?
Yeah, we have a lot of questions, so apologies if I don't get to yours. They're all really good, I promise. There's one from Paul Benoit. I think this would be helpful for a lot of the teachers here today. What are some of the best practices I can use to show how these were women that suffered, and not to frame it or just focus on the narrative that these were witches?
Yeah. Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, I think probably just trying to think about how to frame my answer because I have 5 different things I'd love to say. But what I really appreciate about your question, I guess, is that you're really centering the humanity here. And I think whenever we're talking historically, and you will know this as a teacher, Paul, but I feel this keenly, that emphasizing the humanity of the people we're talking about is critical. So yes, these are women that suffered a great deal of violence. I think, what's so hard, actually, I find in confronting the history of this period that's hundreds of years ago is that students may either think that it's exactly like us, or they may think it's so far distant that we can't relate. And it's somehow finding that way to connect them to just what you said, the fact that people suffered, even though we can't understand fully the phenomenon itself. I think some of the trial records are really good. And I personally, I find, even though I love the primary material that I've linked there at Peabody Essex, I like some of the trial records that are at the UVA site, because the trial records have the voices of the women themselves. And when the women themselves are speaking in court, you hear their, sometimes they're saying, yep, you're right. I did it. I completely did it. And students can speculate, why would they say that? Under what circumstances would they do that? And sometimes you can hear them being angry and talking back. I'm going to forget right now. I was just reading one of these today. The woman was like, what? No, of course not. And they thought she was being prideful. So they condemned her. So I think using the women's voices in the trial transcripts is one of the best ways.
If you don't mind, Dr. Wolf, to follow up on that, 17th century language is so hard for a lot of people to connect with. Do you have any tips for how teachers can engage their students with the primary sources, how they can help them to understand them and be engaged with them?
Yeah, boy, I mean, there's so many issues. I'm sure all of us are thinking about how hard it is for students to read now, to read. I think, and I have young adults of my own at home, and one of mine was just reading Beowulf, and we were going word by word. I think that I'm just going to fall back on something my kid said to me, which is that I myself sometimes do not understand memes on social media. I have no idea what they mean, and they need to be explained to me. And there is a translation process. And that is the same with 17th century language. There's a translation process that's necessary, but it's worthwhile. It's really worthwhile to make that translation. So I guess what you're going to take away from this is that I have all kinds of facile comparisons here. But honestly, I really do think like working through the details of the language is helpful.
Thank you. Summer, another question?
Yeah, I think we're just getting a horde of questions, just asking about the after, which I think is important. So mainly it's just, what were the long-term consequences for those involved? How long did it take to restore the innocence of these women that were accused of witchcraft? How were they able to re-enter into society? Was there a stigma? Do you know anything about the
Yeah.
after?
Yeah, it's mixed is the problem. It would be really amazing if we knew, if we could generalize. It's really mixed. You will not be surprised to know that who were of higher status had an easier time integrating back into society. And for some people, I mean, I don't know what happened to little Dorcas Good. I wish I did know. That's one I really wish I know. I'm sure somebody does know what happened. But in terms of like, how did the society reknit? Well, this is a place that's really growing. Like the population is increasing in a pretty rapid clip, and the economy is really beginning to grow. The historians point to the turn of the 18th century as the point where all of a sudden Atlantic world commerce, of course, deeply implicated in the Atlantic slave trade, but is really beginning to move, and people are beginning to have access to lots more consumer goods from Europe. So there is a way in which some of these folks are really swept into this kind of intensifying world of goods and commerce and population growth. But there are ways that we can see long-term impact in terms of the ongoing gender hierarchy and gender suspicion, the ways that women continue to be under, kind of subordinated. A key other piece I want to mention here, I feel like there's so many pieces to this that I wish it was an easier puzzle to unpack. It's like such a complicated Rubik's Cube. But I talked about this as being really Puritan New England. But the problem is that Puritan religion, which was established with the settlements of New England in Boston and Plymouth and so on, Puritanism is not exactly declining, but really shifting dramatically. And really, it loses its place as the kind of governing principle and governing structure of New England. And England itself is beginning to take a stronger role in governing the New England colonies in the late 17th century. So there's so much that's happening and that's changing. This is part of why Cotton Mather is kind of a frantic mess, is that there's a lot that's happening. Puritans are themselves thinking like, oh my God, our children are no longer going to be members of our churches because we can't persuade them to go through the same conversion thing. So there's so much that's happening here. I totally appreciate your question about like, when did the community come back together? But it's never going to be the same community because things had been changing so dramatically.
Fantastic. Do we have more, Summer?
Yeah, there's one from Brian Lamb about, what was accepted as witchcraft, or like he essentially asked, that people have, an accepted idea of what witches did in particular. Did it differ depending on the region? Was it just a set of collective things? And did the women who were accused actually do these things? I know you mentioned these confessions were coerced, so that might make things a bit more messy, but
Right.
yeah.
Did people really believe that what they were doing was witchcraft? I think there is no way to recover that. If you read something like Arthur Miller's Crucible, he says, oh, sure, these women were actually dabbling. There have been other kinds of popular culture representations that say, some of the girls, and in fact, there's a little bit of historical evidence that say the original girls who were in the minister's house, Samuel Parris's household, in late 1691, I don't know, bored adolescents were sort of like trying to maybe dabble in witchcraft. I don't know. When I was a kid, I had a magic 8-ball, but like it was, were they being more serious than that? I don't know. But were they dabbling in something that all of a sudden got out of control? Maybe. But did anyone genuinely believe that they were a witch? I can't answer that, and I don't think we have access to that. I know that there are different interpretations. There are some people who really believe that there was supernatural activity, and that there remains a kind of community of witchcraft in and around Salem. I recommend highly the novels by my friend Deb Harkness, the All Souls trilogy. Her newest one, Blackbird Oracle, just came out, and it's I will just say that Bridget Bishop, one of the first witches accused, figures largely in Blackbird Oracle.
Can I follow up on that too? I went to high school a very long time ago, but we did have to read the Crucible, and I remember my teacher having us watch Three Sovereigns for Sarah right after as sort of a counterpoint to it. What do you think about teaching the Crucible in school? Like, is there anything that we should know or do to help balance out the story?
Well, the Crucible is art, and it's I just saw I wish I could remember the name of the playwright and the name of the play I saw here at Trinity Rep last fall. That was essentially like, what, Arthur Miller was a kind of misogynist himself, and the way he conveyed these women, you've got to be kidding me. And it was actually a kind of funny take on how Arthur Miller tried to make John Proctor look, and so on. I mean, I think we teach literature as literature, and we have to treat historical evidence as material that was created in its own time as well. How to balance that out? Three Sovereigns for Sarah. It's funny that you mentioned that, because a lot of historians really like that docudrama. I'm trying to remember who's the great actress in that. Vanessa Redgrave, right? But it's interesting that Boyer and Nissenbaum actually dislike it, because they think that it draws this distinction in the socioeconomic conflict between the parts of Salem Village, and they're like, no, not right. So super interesting. I saw a question, Summer. Can I just jump in here on one?
Yeah, go ahead.
I see a question about what about the demographic makeup of the colonies generally? Is this a time when there's a real demographic imbalance between men and women? And is that why there's so much kind of focus on women? And actually, it's such a good question, but the British colonies have really different demographic situations. And while the demographics in the southern colonies, the Chesapeake, Virginia, Maryland, and even further south, is quite imbalanced, in New England, right from the start, right from the 1620s, the demographic balance is pretty even. And it's part also of why the New England settler population grows pretty fast, because there are even number of men and women. They mostly they marry, but they always have babies. So that's not a factor. But thank you for that question, because I think it's a good one. I think it's something we hear about the settler colonists.
I think we have time for one more, Summer. Is there one more? Well, I know there's a lot more.
Yeah.
Or Dr. Wulf, if you see one that you want to answer, like that would be great.
Oh, I'm saying, let's see. Wow, there's so many good ones here.
Yeah.
Didn't it start due to some girls having nightmares? This is from Robert. Well, yes and no. That is that there were girls who were involved as the accusers. The first accusers were younger girls, but they were overwhelmed pretty quickly by grown-up accusers. And it did start with them, but one of the explanations people sometimes give is that they were girls in the household of Samuel Parris, who was the minister, an unpopular minister by some serious accounts. And, they were probably caught doing something they shouldn't have been. Maybe they were messing around with, pretending to be magic-y or something, like really the equivalent of my magic 8-ball, not like anything too intense. And so, maybe, but like I said, accusers quickly became grown-ups accusing other grown-ups. Sometimes people have said, but what about, wasn't there something in the food that gave them, some hallucinogenic property? People have mentioned mushrooms. I've seen there was a strain of explanation for a while there about like maybe it was something in the grain, a certain kind of rye that had a certain fungus growing on it. I think that's the magic mushrooms that people are thinking. It's the fungus on the rye. But actually that's been discredited as well. I go back to Sarah Rivett's point that it would be really nice if we could find a rational explanation for this. I see someone else asking, wasn't it just about a land grab? It would, if we could say, yep, sure, here's the very thing. It was socioeconomics, it was this, it was that. But I think it's a really complex situation when societies turn to this kind of feral violence, basically. And it's pretty multi-causal, multi-dimensional. And there's probably no one explanation.
Yeah. There's a question that had come in. I think it was emailed to us. What impact did the Salem witchcraft trials have on African women? And we haven't spoken about that. Did it have an impact on African women?
Yeah, so I don't have a great answer for that. We think Tituba, was, as I said, was indigenous, although precise origins kind of unknown. Wonderful novel by Marisa Conde about Tituba. And she's a fascinating character there. And there are African descended people in New England by this point, enslaved African people in New England by this point, but they're a pretty small population. They remain a pretty small population. Mm-hmm. So there does not seem to be, like, for example, there does not seem to be a phenomenon where African or African descended people are created as a kind of other who attract accusations and witchcraft accusations. There are other places in the colonies and other places like in the Caribbean, for example, where African spiritual practices become demonized by enslavers and Christianized settlers, but that doesn't seem to be any kind of a significant dynamic in New England.
All right. Did you want to see if there's one more question you want to answer? We have 2 minutes left.
Oh, I think these are great.
There are a lot of questions.
I know. I'm just like literally scrolling through here. What connection do I see between this event and the American Revolution? I love that question because that's like a real wild card question. But let me say this. I think there is, in the sense that I think we have a pretty pat understanding of the revolution, which is itself multi-causal and complex. And there's no way to explain it easily. People participated in the American Revolution as loyalists, some as patriots, some as didn't care at all. It's just a really complex phenomenon. So there's no through line, Salem to American Revolution, but what there is a common method for thinking about the complexity of the past and trying to retrieve the humanity of the people there.
All right. And before we end for the evening, do you have any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
Well, I just thank you for the opportunity to talk about history, which is so great. And thank you all so much for your wonderful questions. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to talk about more of them.
Yeah, it was like a fantastic Q&A. So it's one of those days where we could have probably gone on for another hour, but we're going to let you guys go to have the rest of your Thursday night back. In case you really want a lot more history, we have some upcoming programs. Our next Inside the Vault program will be November 7th, and we're going to be discussing the first Black cadets at West Point with Lieutenant Colonel Rory McGovern. He's actually got a book coming out this month. So if you want to pick that up ahead of time, that would be great. And book breaks this Sunday, October 6th. Aisha Roscoe will be discussing her book, HBCU Made, a celebration of the Black college experience. These are fantastic programs, and I hope you're going to join us for them. And with that, I want to say a final thank you to Dr. Wulf. This has been a fantastic evening. I hope all of you will go out and study more, because who knows, maybe we can figure out a little bit more about what's going on in our past. But with that, have a great evening, everyone. Bye.